I had rehearsed my breathing in the parking lot of the attorney's office, counting the rise and fall of my chest until I could convince myself that walking through those glass doors wouldn't reopen everything I had spent years stitching shut. But grief has a way of finding seams, and the moment I stepped into the reception area, still heavy with the scent of polished wood and stale coffee, I felt that familiar split. My sister, Lila, was already there, leaning against the wall as if she were the one exhausted by months of caretaking instead of the one who called twice a year with the emotional distance of a weather report. She didn't turn toward me, not fully. Just a sideways glance, sharp and assessing, like she wanted to check whether I had the audacity to look steady. I did, but only on the outside. Inside, the old currents were shifting, the guilt, the resentment, the protective instinct I could never quite extinguish even during the worst years. I told myself that the reading of Our Father's will was only a formality, the final administrative step in a life that had been complicated and uneven. Still, seeing her here, composed and expectant, made something tighten in my throat. The attorney, a man named Harrow, emerged from his office with the kind of solemnity that suggested he practiced it. He gestured for us to follow, and the three of us entered a room too small for the amount of silence it contained. I took my seat at the far end of the table. Lila chose the one closest to the attorney, sliding into it with a confidence that felt rehearsed, as though she'd spent the morning imagining herself in positions of ownership. I avoided looking at her directly, because every time I did, memory tried to pull me backward. It wanted to return me to that long stretch of years when Our Father's health declined in slow, uneven increments. It wanted to replay the nights I stayed on his couch, listening to him struggle to stand without falling. It wanted to remind me that Lila visited only when the guilt finally pressed too hard to ignore, and even then she left before the loneliness could settle on her like dust. But I kept those memories tucked in the quiet part of my mind, the part one used for storage rather than display. A thin envelope lay on the table, sealed with a level of precision that made me think Father must have insisted on it. He always believed order could prevent chaos. He was wrong, but I admired the attempt. As you know, Harrow began, unfolding a pair of reading glasses, your father left clear instructions regarding his estate. The word estate felt too large for the room. I heard Lila inhale, slow and measured, the way someone breathes right before claiming a prize. She glanced at me then, a quick flicker of triumph she didn't bother to hide. She had always assumed the mansion would be hers, the turreted house on the hill, the one she used to photograph endlessly when we were teenagers, imagining it as the future backdrop of a life better than the one she had. I never envy. Harrow cleared his throat, drawing both our gazes. Your father made several specific bequests, he said, sliding a folded sheet of paper from the envelope. His fingers stopped at the center of the page, and I watched his eyes narrow, as though he were preparing himself for the shift that would follow the next sentence. Before I continue, I should state that your father executed an amendment to his will 6 months ago, after a review of certain financial and legal matters. Lila stiffened. I noticed the subtle movement, a tightening of her shoulders, a slight lift of her chin. She was bracing herself, though she didn't yet know for what. The attorney continued. To begin, he expressed gratitude to both of you for the roles you played in his later years. His voice hesitated on both, and though it was only a fraction of a pause, it carried meaning. I felt it land quietly on the table between us. He wished to acknowledge the personal sacrifices involved. Lila's expression faltered, just briefly. Small cracks appeared at the corners of her composure. Harrow then folded his hands on the desk. Before we address the distribution of real property, including the residence, I should clarify an important fact. The mansion on Ridgeview Hill. Lila leaned forward. Was transferred out of your father's ownership 10 years ago. The silence that followed was not the kind that grows naturally. It was the kind that arrives violently, severing the air. Lila blinked, once, as though her vision had blurred. "That's not possible," she said, though her voice no longer carried certainty. It had thinned, almost trembling. "He lived there. He told me." Harrow lifted another document from the envelope, carefully sliding it across the table. "Your father placed the property into an irrevocable trust at that time, citing personal reasons. He was clear that it would not form part of his estate. I didn't reach for the paper. I didn't need to. I remembered the year he created the trust. It was the same year he told me, in a rare moment of vulnerability, that he wanted the house to be more than inheritance bait. He wanted it to remain untouched by expectation or entitlement. I hadn't known the legal structure he chose, but I had known his intent. It was one of the last things he confided in me before his health began to fade." Across from me, Lila finally reached for the document, her hand trembling so slightly she tried to disguise the movement by adjusting her sleeve. She read only the first few lines before looking up, eyes sharp with something between confusion and betrayal. "He never told me," she said, the words breaking apart at the edges. She wasn't wrong. Father had been meticulous, but he had also been guarded when it came to her. He wanted a relationship with her, of course he did, but he feared the volatility that came with her expectations. He once told me that giving her too much at once felt like handing someone a lit match in a dry field. Harrow continued speaking, though Lila didn't seem to hear him. "This means the property is not part of the estate we will be dividing today. We will proceed with the remaining assets shortly." I watched my sister as she swallowed hard, clearing her throat in an attempt to recover what dignity she felt slipping away. I recognized something in her eyes, not the entitlement I had always braced myself for, but something older, rawer, almost childlike. It was the expression she used to have after Father canceled one of her extravagant plans, the ones built on fantasies he couldn't afford and she never appreciated. Back then, she responded with stormy anger. Today, she seemed momentarily hollowed out, as if the revelation had reached some quiet part of her she didn't know still existed. Still, I didn't reach for her. Old habits urged me forward, the instinct to soften her landing, to absorb the impact, but I remained still. This moment was hers, not mine to manage. Harrow folded the papers neatly. "When you're ready, we'll continue," he offered gently. My sister stared at the table, her jaw tightening as she attempted to rebuild her composure piece by piece. I could almost see the architecture of her denial forming again, the scaffolding she used to climb above discomfort. But she hadn't reached its upper floors yet. Not this time. When she finally looked at me, her expression wasn't accusatory. It was searching, almost pleading, though she couldn't quite bring herself to ask the question directly. "Did you know?" That was the shape of it. The unspoken accusation. The fear that Father had trusted me with something he hadn't entrusted to her. I didn't answer. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because truth carried heat, and I knew she was already burning. And the will reading hadn't even truly begun. Harrow gave us a few minutes before continuing, but the pause didn't soothe anything. It only allowed the air to thicken, settling over us like the dust that collects on abandoned furniture, quiet, persistent, unavoidable. Lila kept her gaze fixed on the edge of the table, as though the grain of the wood might realign itself into an explanation that made sense. I almost envied her for hoping the story might change if she stared hard enough. I had learned long ago that truth doesn't bend just because someone wants it to. When the attorney finally resumed, his voice sounded gentler than before, but not pitying. "Your father requested certain personal items be distributed first," he said, lifting another sheet. "To his eldest daughter, Lila, he leaves the antique writing desk from his study." The sentence hovered between us. I remembered that desk, narrow, heavy, with drawers that stuck if you didn't angle them just right. When we were young, Father had tried to get Lila to use it for schoolwork, imagining structure would settle her restless spirit. She'd insisted it was too old, too small, too stiff, and preferred the floor or the kitchen table. Yet now, hearing it named, I saw her shoulders straighten as if reclaiming a piece of authority she felt slipping from her grasp. And, Harrow continued, he also wished her to have the silver photograph frame from his bedroom. That frame held a picture of the two of us at ages 6 and 9, sitting on the hood of his car after he'd taken us for ice cream. I wondered if Lila remembered that day. She'd cried because our cones melted faster than we could eat them, and Father had laughed, not at her, but at the way she clung to hope even when it dripped down her wrists. He'd taken the picture moments later, before the sun dipped behind the trees. It wasn't a glamorous memory, but it was real. Perhaps that was why he chose it. Lila didn't react outwardly, but her fingers curled lightly against the table, as though gripping something invisible. I could tell she was rearranging the information in her mind, trying to fit the pieces into a story where she wasn't losing ground. The attorney shifted to the next item. To his younger daughter, he paused only long enough for me to feel the weight of being named second. He leaves his journals from the last 15 years and the correspondence files stored in his safe. I hadn't expected that. My pulse quickened, not from excitement but from the quiet ache of recognition. Father had always been a private man. The few times I'd glimpsed him writing late at night, he'd close the journal gently but firmly, assuring me it wasn't secrecy, only habit. And yet, near the end, he had asked if I remembered the combination to his safe. He'd said it casually, almost in passing, but now I understood it had been deliberate. Across the table, Lila's expression flickered. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper, less visible, but I felt the tremor of it, a sense that she was losing a version of Father she had imagined into existence, one built on selective memories and unspoken assumptions. Harrow organized the pages before him. The remaining financial assets, he said, were to be divided equally between both of you. Lila exhaled sharply. Fairness, on paper, wasn't what she had come for. She wanted validation. She wanted the mansion, the symbol, not the structure. Something that confirmed she had been the favored one all along, even when her behavior contradicted the fantasy. But the estate wasn't done surprising her. There is one more provision, Harrow said, sliding a final document closer to himself. It concerns the trust. The words struck like a bell. Lila looked up instantly, and I felt my own breath hitch despite knowing I had no claim to fear. As you now understand, he said gently, the Ridgeview property was removed from your father's estate and placed into an irrevocable trust. The terms of that trust were meant to remain private, but your father included a brief statement in this letter, which he asked to be read aloud to both daughters. I felt my spine straighten, the way it used to when Father was about to say something true. Harrow unfolded the letter. My daughters, he read, I know this trust has caused confusion and, perhaps, disappointment. I made this decision long before illness forced smaller choices upon me. The house was never meant to be a reward, nor a source of conflict. It was built with promises I could not keep and memories I could not protect. I did not want it to become the battleground I feared it would. Therefore, I placed it elsewhere, in hands that would not compete for it. Lila's face tightened, not in anger, but in bewilderment. What does that mean? She whispered, though the question wasn't for me. Harrow continued reading. I hope one day you understand that I did not take anything from you. I simply returned something to the people it once belonged to. Silence pressed in again. The words felt heavy, almost coded, and yet unmistakably intentional. I glanced at Lila, half expecting the old sharpness to surface, the defensive spike she relied on whenever the world refused to rearrange itself around her. But instead she seemed unmoored, as though the floor she'd been standing on had quietly dissolved. "Your father did not elaborate," Harrow said, folding the letter carefully. "The records regarding the trust list only the legal entity that owns it. I cannot disclose its beneficiaries without cause." His tone softened. "And nothing in the will grants either of you rights to challenge it." Lila leaned back slowly, her pupils dark with confusion. For years she'd assumed the mansion was her inheritance by right of personality, as though wanting it enough guaranteed a claim. Now she was being forced to accept the strange truth: father had already removed the entire possibility from the narrative. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt something closer to exhaustion. "We can take a short break," Harrow offered. "This is a great deal to process." But neither of us stood. It was as if our bodies refused to move until the emotional dust settled enough for our feet to find new ground. After a long moment, Lila spoke, quiet, unsteady. "He didn't trust me." Her voice wasn't confrontational. It carried the fragile bewilderment of someone encountering their own reflection and finding it unfamiliar. I didn't rush to contradict her. Honesty had always been the thin thread between us, fragile and frayed, but real. "I don't think it was about trust," I said eventually, choosing my words carefully. "He didn't want the house to define what we thought he owed us." She looked at me as though trying to decide if I believed what I was saying. Maybe she wondered if I had known more than I admitted. Maybe she thought I'd been silently guarding a secret edge. But I hadn't. Father shared pieces with me, yes, but never the whole architecture. And I had never asked for it. "I don't understand," she murmured, pressing her fingertips to her temples. "He knew I loved that house." The truth hovered between us: she loved the idea of the house. The way it looked when lit by afternoon sun. The way people reacted when she mentioned it. The way it symbolized a life where she had never been the difficult one, the unpredictable one, the one father worried about at night. But I didn't say any of that. I didn't need to. She was already chasing those thoughts herself. When Harrow left the room to give us privacy, the quiet became sharper. Lila finally lifted her gaze to me, her eyes raw in a way I hadn't seen since we were children. "Why didn't he tell me?" she asked, not as an accusation but a plea. I thought of the nights father confided in me, soft admissions he'd release only after exhaustion stripped away his guard. "I don't know how to reach her. I don't want to hurt her, but I don't want to lie either. I wish she understood I'm trying." I could have shared those truths. I could have let them spill into the room and land gently in her open hands. Instead, I chose a quieter path. "Maybe he wanted to protect you," I said. "From expectations he couldn't meet." Her mouth trembled. Not dramatically, just a small shift, but enough to hint at a crack forming somewhere beneath her ribs. For years, Lila had seemed impermeable. She lived in fast bursts of certainty, shifting directions whenever discomfort threatened to slow her down. Seeing her now, fragile and still, felt almost wrong, as though I were intruding on something private. I wanted to reach across the table, not to comfort her exactly, but to anchor her. Yet I stayed where I was. The story unfolding belonged to both of us, but the pain entering her eyes was particular to her alone. She whispered, "I thought he saw me." "He did," I said, quietly. "Just not always the way you wanted him to." Her breath caught. I saw the moment she swallowed it down, forcing composure over vulnerability. The scaffolding was rebuilding itself again, slow, shaky, but familiar. Harrow returned, carrying a thin folder. "There is one final matter," he said. Something your father asked me to give you personally. He handed it to me. My name was written on the front in father's handwriting, small, slanted, careful. I didn't open it. He wanted you to have it alone, Harrow clarified. But you may choose to share it later. Lila watched the folder with an intensity one could feel like static. She didn't ask what was inside, though the question hovered on her lips. I think we're done for today, Harrow said, gathering the remaining documents. But we weren't done. Not really. The will had been read, the assets divided, the truth revealed, but something larger had shifted, something neither of us could articulate yet. As we walked out of the office, side by side but not together, I felt the weight of the folder in my hand. It felt small, harmless, but somehow capable of changing the way I remembered our father, and perhaps the way Lila remembered herself. Outside, the air smelled like damp pavement and cooling wind, and for a moment I wished we could pause in that threshold between past and aftermath. But Lila was already stepping ahead, her posture gathering the remnants of her pride, preparing for whatever confrontation she intended next. And I knew, by the set of her shoulders, by the tremor in her breath, that the story of the mansion was nowhere near finished. I didn't open the folder that night. It sat untouched on my kitchen table, its presence both quiet and insistent, the way unfinished conversations tend to linger in the corners of a room. I kept circling around it, brushing past it on my way to refill a glass of water or turn off a lamp, but each time I reached for it, something in me recoiled. Grief has a strange rhythm, it urges you forward and holds you back at the same time. By morning the hesitation had taken on its own shape. I realized I wasn't afraid of what father had written. I was afraid of knowing more than Lila, of carrying yet another truth she had been excluded from. Our childhood had been threaded with those imbalances, small, unspoken privileges granted to me only because I stayed and she ran. I didn't want another reason for her to believe the story she sometimes built around me, that I was the quiet favorite, the one who earned a trust she didn't know how to chase. I finally opened the folder just after sunrise, when the light in my kitchen was soft and neutral, revealing details without bitterness. Inside was a single letter, written in father's familiar slanted script. There was also a key, small, bronze, old enough to show wear along the teeth. I didn't recognize it. The letter began without preamble. If you're reading this, then the decisions I made have become real in a way I can't soften. I wish I could sit beside you as you open this, but life doesn't always allow us to explain ourselves in the order we intend. I had to stop for a moment. Not because the words hurt, but because they sounded like him, not the version shaped by illness or distance, but the man who used to fix leaky faucets himself rather than call someone, who believed problems were easier to face when you could place your hands directly on what needed mending. He continued. The truth is simple, but it will not feel simple to your sister. The trust that holds the house belongs to a family your mother knew before she passed, people who helped us in ways I never spoke about. The mansion was only ours because of a debt they allowed me to postpone for decades. When they fell on difficult times, I returned it. It was not generosity. It was responsibility. A faint memory stirred, mother standing at the bottom of the staircase years ago, speaking softly to a couple I didn't recognize, her hand resting on the banister as if bracing herself. I remembered father guiding them into the study, the door closing firmly behind them. I hadn't known who they were. I still didn't. I didn't tell you or Lila because I knew the story of the house had grown larger than its reality. I hoped the trust would remove the temptation to anchor your lives to it. You have always understood that your value is not measured in square footage or property lines. Your sister struggles with that. She always has. He never spoke harshly about her, not even near the end, but the truth in that line felt solid, delivered without judgment, only clarity. This key opens the drawer beneath the window seat in the study. I never spoke of what's inside because I didn't want to reopen wounds that had barely healed. But now it belongs to you. You may share it with your sister if you choose. Or you may decide it is not time. My hands hesitated on the final paragraph, as though some part of me expected the page to heat beneath my fingers. Take care of her, even when she thinks she doesn't need you. Especially then. I spent too many years believing I could love her into steadiness. You understand better than I ever did that steadiness comes from within. Help her find it, not by carrying her weight, but by setting yours down beside her and letting her see it. The signature was small, almost shy. I folded the letter gently, aware of the tremor building behind my ribs. The key lay beside it, a quiet invitation. I didn't call Lila. Not immediately. She needed time to rebuild her face into something she felt she could walk the world with. And I needed time to decide whether opening that drawer alone would betray something between us that was still fragile, still unspoken. She arrived at my apartment door that afternoon anyway. I heard her footsteps before she knocked, hesitant, uneven, like she wasn't sure she wanted to be there. When I opened the door, her eyes were puffy, though she had done her best to conceal it with makeup. The effort only made the exhaustion more visible. "Can we talk?" she asked. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't even a request. It was something softer, worn down by hours of confronting truths she wasn't prepared for. I stepped aside to let her in. She glanced at the folder on the table immediately. Of course she did. She had always been drawn to things that might redefine her place in any story. "Did you read it?" she asked. I nodded. "This morning." She took a slow breath, the kind that shuddered on its way out. "Is it about the house?" "In part," I said. "But mostly it's about us." Her attention wavered. She wasn't used to that, being named in a way that didn't involve expectation or evaluation. She moved toward the table, stopped halfway, and turned to me. "Did he explain why he gave it away?" she asked, voice tight. "He returned it to the people it belonged to." She tried to absorb that, but confusion clouded her expression, followed quickly by hurt. "He trusted strangers more than his daughters?" I shook my head. No. It wasn't about trust. It was history he carried before we were old enough to understand what it meant. She lowered herself into a chair, elbows on her knees, palms pressed together. For the first time since the will reading, she looked less defensive, less poised to guard her pride. Instead, she seemed simply tired. "I keep thinking," she said slowly, "that he didn't believe I could handle anything real." I sat across from her. "He believed you needed time. And he wasn't wrong. You're still figuring out who you are when no one else is watching." She let the words settle, not resisting them the way she once would have. Her eyes drifted to the folder again. "Can I see it?" she asked. I slid it toward her. She opened the letter, reading each line without rushing. I watched her expression shift subtly, confusion giving way to sorrow, sorrow giving way to something I couldn't quite name. At one point she closed her eyes, letting the weight of father's honesty settle in. She touched the key last. "What's this for?" she asked quietly. "A drawer in the study." She hesitated. "Do you know what's inside?" "No." "Do you want to find out?" The question surprised me, not the words themselves, but the tremor of invitation in them. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a test. It was the closest thing to partnership we'd had in years. "We can go together," I said. She nodded, pressing the key into her palm as though anchoring herself to the idea. The drive to the mansion took 20 minutes. Neither of us spoke much. The house appeared through the windshield slowly, its familiar silhouette rising behind the trees. It looked unchanged, exactly as it always had, quiet, towering, slightly austere. For years it had been a symbol of everything unresolved between us. Today it felt more like a witness than a prize. The front door was unlocked, as it had been during Father's final months. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and stillness. Crossing the threshold felt like stepping into a memory rather than a place. We moved through the foyer without speaking. The study door remained open, just as Father had left it on his better days. I felt my throat tighten as we entered. The window seat was bathed in weak afternoon light, illuminating dust motes that floated like slow-moving thoughts. Lila approached first. She knelt in front of the seat, feeling along the bottom edge until her fingertips grazed a small, recessed lock. She slid the key in, and the mechanism clicked softly. The drawer opened with a slow resistance, as if releasing breath it had held for years. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied with twine. Some were addressed to Father. Some from him. Others bore Mother's handwriting, delicate and looping. Lila stared at them, then at me. What is all this? I lifted the top letter carefully. The return address matched the fragment of memory I'd held, the couple I'd seen once without understanding who they were. These are the people who owned the land before the mansion was built, I said quietly. The ones Father mentioned. We sifted through the letters cautiously, reading parts aloud. The story that emerged was stark and human. Mother had been close to the family years before meeting Father. When financial hardship threatened their home, Father intervened, buying the land under the condition that he could repay them someday when their circumstances changed. When they fell on difficult times years later, he honored that promise. There was nothing dramatic in the letters, no betrayal, no scandal, no deception. Only obligation, gratitude, hardship, and the complicated shape of loyalty. Lila pressed a hand to her mouth. He wasn't choosing them over us, she whispered. He was trying to repair something they lost. I nodded. And he didn't want the truth to become another wound. She sank onto the window seat, eyes unfocused but no longer clouded with defensiveness. The edges of her pain had softened, replaced by a dawning understanding she seemed almost afraid to touch. I think I made it all about me, she said slowly. For years. Maybe forever. The admission wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, a soft recognition finally allowed into daylight. You wanted to feel chosen, I said. There's nothing wrong with that. She looked at me with a rawness I hadn't seen in her since childhood. I always thought you were stronger than me. That he leaned on you because you could handle it. I didn't understand that he wasn't choosing between us. He was just trying. Her voice broke, not loudly, but enough. I sat beside her, not touching her, just close enough that she could feel the presence she had spent years misinterpreting as judgment. She didn't look at me, but her shoulder brushed mine in a way that felt unintentional and yet deeply deliberate. After a long silence, she asked, "What do we do now?" "We start where he left us," I said. "With the truth. Even if it's uncomfortable." She nodded, then looked around the study as if seeing it without the weight of inheritance pressing on her. "It's still beautiful," she said softly. "It always was," I replied. "Just not in the way you thought." We gathered the letters carefully, leaving the drawer open. It didn't feel right to close it again, not now that the story had finally been shared. As we walked out of the mansion, the late afternoon light stretched across the floor, illuminating the path to the door. Lila paused once, glancing back, not with possession, not with longing, but with a quiet farewell to a version of her life that no longer defined her. Outside, the breeze carried the scent of pine and cooling earth. She inhaled deeply, shoulders lowering as though releasing something she'd held too tightly for too long. When we reached the car, she turned to me, eyes steadier than I had seen in years. "Thank you for not giving up on me," she said. "I never did," I answered. "I just stopped trying to carry what wasn't mine." For the first time, she understood the difference. We drove away with no claim to the mansion, no title, no inheritance battle to fuel resentment. What we had instead was something far harder to obtain, a truth we both survived long enough to face, and a relationship no longer balanced on assumptions or unspoken debts. Father hadn't left us the house. He hadn't left us certainty. But he had left us something quieter and more enduring, a chance to begin again, without the illusion that either of us was owed more than the other. And as the mansion disappeared behind the curve of the road, I realized that for the first time in years, neither of us was looking back to see what we'd lost. We were finally facing forward.